What if everything humanity has ever believed was a lie? That is the question that rippled across the Imperium like a psychic scream, silent, yet deafening. It began as a whisper, drifting through forgotten data vaults, forbidden archives, and the terrified minds of astropaths who swore they felt something break across the warp. At first, no one dared to say the words aloud. They were too dangerous, too impossible, too world-ending, but truth has a way of crawling into the light, even in a galaxy where light rarely survives. And so, the question spread, hesitant, trembling, unstoppable. What happens now? What happens when the illusion that has held humanity together for 10,000 years finally cracks? What happens when the Emperor truly dies? For most citizens of the Imperium, the Emperor was not a person. He was belief, he was ritual, he was safety, he was the only constant in a universe built on nightmares. Millions prayed every hour. Billions lived and died in his name without ever seeing a single sun beyond their factory hive. To them, the Emperor could not die. The Emperor was existence itself. But then came the silence, subtle, wrong, and felt first by those cursed with psychic sensitivity. A stillness at the heart of the Astronomicon. A faint thinning of the guiding light that had steered warp travel for millennia. Navigators panicked, ships drifted off course, and somewhere deep within the Imperium's soul, a fear older than humanity itself stirred awake. The truth spread like a sickness. First to the priests, then to the commanders, then to the highest orders who had kept the secret for as long as they could. There were no trumpets, no proclamations, no grand declarations. Just a void where divinity once stood. The Golden Throne, once a blazing psychic inferno, had begun to dim, not in a single catastrophic collapse, but in a slow, dying exhale, like a god giving up its final breath. And those who examined the sacred mechanisms spoke in trembling voices. The Emperor's presence, faint and fractured for 10,000 years, was vanishing. Whispers became rumors. Rumors became panic. Panic became the first sparks of rebellion and collapse. Planetary governors locked their worlds down, terrified of being blamed. The ecclesiarchy began purging its own priests, terrified that doubt would spread faster than they could contain it. And still the question lingered, quiet, poisonous, undeniable. If the Emperor is gone, what holds back the darkness now? The Imperium had always been fragile, held together by fanaticism, fear, and the psychic shadow of a dying god. But now, without warning, without ceremony, that shadow was fading. Across hive cities and forge worlds, across death worlds and shrine worlds, a strange storm of dread settled over humanity. Families gathered in silence. Workers felt a coldness they could not explain. Soldiers whispered prayers more desperately than ever before. Something vast, ancient, and catastrophic was coming. Everyone could feel it, and somewhere, buried beneath the surface of every frightened mind, the same horrifying realization began to bloom. The truth did not emerge with an explosion, it seeped. Quietly, insidiously, like poison leaking into a reservoir that billions depended on for survival. In the first hours after the Emperor's psychic presence began to fade, confusion spread faster than any official message could. Astropaths screamed in their sleep. Choirs across the Imperium collapsed into silence, their voices severed mid-chant. Some died instantly, others descended into madness, clawing at their own eyes as if trying to tear out the last echoes of the Emperor's vanishing light. But most disturbing of all was the sudden quiet in the warp, a quiet that should never have existed. The ecclesiarchy was the first to sense the danger, but even they failed to agree on what the signs meant. Cardinal worlds erupted into doctrinal war within hours. Some priests proclaimed that this was a divine test, a trial that would separate the faithful from the weak. Others insisted that heretics had sabotaged the Golden Throne, and demanded immediate purges of anyone showing fear. And then there were those, rare, trembling, and doomed, who whispered the unthinkable truth: the Emperor's light is gone. These whispers were silenced quickly, but not quickly enough. Once the idea entered a mind, it rooted itself like a splinter. If the Emperor could die, then he was never a god. If he was never a god, then everything was built on a lie. That idea alone was enough to start the first fractures. On distant frontier worlds, cut off from reliable communication, planetary governors panicked. Some declared martial law, others shut themselves inside their palaces, convinced assassins were coming for them. Entire regiments of the Astra Militarum mutinied when they realized their navigators could no longer guarantee safe passage through the warp. Ships refused to launch. Supply lines froze. Millions of soldiers sat stranded and helpless on barren worlds, watching their rations dwindle and wondering if reinforcements would ever come. And then came the schism of Mars. The tech priests had always known more about the Golden Throne than they admitted. They felt its weakening through the noosphere, a distortion that pulsed like a slowing heart. The Fabricator General himself locked the highest councils of Mars into emergency conclaves, but the Mechanicus was never unified for long. Red-robed adepts argued with furious binary streams, accusing one another of corruption, sabotage, or betrayal of the Omniscia. Some factions declared that the Emperor's death proved the machine god was independent, that the Imperium had lied for 10,000 years. Others violently disagreed. Skitarii legions were mobilized. Titans stood to battle readiness. For a moment, humanity teetered on the edge of a civil war unlike any before, not born of ambition, but of terror. Across the galaxy, a single realization began to spread, slow, creeping, and all-consuming. No one was in control anymore. Not the priests, not the generals, not the lords of Terra. No one. Without the Emperor's psychic shadow looming over humanity, the Imperium felt suddenly naked. Exposed, vulnerable, as if the universe itself were leaning in, sniffing at the scent of a wounded prey. The warp stirred, the shadows lengthened, and the predators began to take interest. But even as fear blossomed into chaos, most of humanity still clung to denial. How could the Emperor be dead? How could the unthinkable be true? They awaited a statement from Terra, a proclamation from the High Lords, anything to explain what was happening. None came, and in the silence, the fractures widened. Terra had always been the beating heart of the Imperium, a world so drenched in history, sacrifice, and sacred duty that even its polluted air seemed heavy with purpose. But now, for the first time in 10,000 years, Terra felt hollow. Quiet, wrong. The High Lords gathered in panic, their ancient chamber echoing with arguments so frantic they bordered on hysteria. Servitors recorded none of it. Every word was classified before it was spoken. Every political alliance fractured before it could hold. For 10,000 years, the Golden Throne had burned at the center of the palace, a crippled god's life support system fused with machinery so ancient and complex that even the Mechanicus no longer understood all its secrets. It had never been silent. Even at its weakest, it emitted a low psychic hum, felt more than heard, like a steady pulse radiating through the stones and steel of the entire palace complex. It was the Emperor's presence. His will, his silent oversight, but now, there was nothing. Tech priests stationed in the sanctum stood motionless, their mechadendrites twitching in disbelieving spasms. For the first time since the Horus heresy, the arcane mechanisms beneath the throne showed no psychic resonance. No golden glow, no whisper of power, just cold metal and fading embers. A terrible stillness hung in the air, so profound that even the servitors halted mid-function, as if waiting for a command that would never come. The High Lords demanded answers. The Fabricator General delivered only what he dared to speak aloud, his presence is no longer detectable. But those words were a lie dressed as caution. What he truly meant was simpler, and far deadlier: the Emperor is gone. The Inquisition reacted first. Grand Inquisitors, their faces masks of frozen dread, invoked absolute authority and sealed Terra. No ship could land, no ship could depart, no astropathic messages were permitted. They called it containment. But everyone knew the truth. This was fear disguised as protocol. Fear that the galaxy would learn what they already suspected. Fear that the greatest lie in human history was finally collapsing under its own weight. Deep within the Inquisition's strongest fortress, a conclave gathered, inquisitors of every ordo, every philosophy, every level of fanaticism. They debated not what had happened, but how to control the narrative. Should they tell the truth? No. Should they fabricate a miracle? Possibly. Should they execute anyone who questioned the official story? Absolutely. Yet even as they conspired, the warp currents shifted like a storm turning its gaze. Psychers on Terra collapsed in droves, screaming as they witnessed a void where the Emperor's psychic beacon once stood. A void so vast, so unnatural, that it felt like a wound carved into reality itself. Some clawed their faces off in terror. Others died from seizures that crushed their hearts. And a few whispered something else, something worse. He is not in the warp. That message spread among the Ordos like wildfire. Even the most hardened inquisitors feared its implications. A mortal dying left an imprint in the Imperium. A psyker left a storm. A primarch could shake the warp with his death throes. But the Emperor should have been a supernova in the psychic realm. His passing should have torn the warp open. Instead, silence. A silence more terrifying than any scream. And that stillness did what no enemy had ever accomplished, it shattered the unity of Terra. Each High Lord retreated into Paranoia, seeing rivals in every shadow. Assassins were dispatched, armored regiments mobilized. The palace became a fortress within a fortress, each faction defending its corner like a cornered beast. But perhaps worst of all was the desperation that crept into the voices of the Adeptus Custodes. For the first time in their immortal lives, the guardians of the Emperor spoke not with confidence, but with doubt. They gathered outside the throne room, standing vigil as they always had, but their stillness was no longer serene, it was tense. Some refused to believe he was gone. Some refused to admit it. And some quietly accepted the truth with a grief so profound it could have drowned a planet. Yet none dared open the sealed sarcophagus of the throne. None dared confirm the truth with their own eyes. For in the shattered halls of the Imperial palace, one whispered fear echoed louder than all others. The Astronomicon had always been the Imperium's most sacred paradox, a lighthouse built from suffering. For 10,000 years, its impossible beam of psychic brilliance had carved a stable path. Through the roiling sea of the warp, it allowed billions of ships to cross the galaxy. It connected distant worlds. It held a civilization of 1,000,000 planets together by the thinnest thread imaginable. And though most of humanity never saw it, never understood it, they depended on it more than air, water, or faith. But now that thread began to unravel. At first, the navigators sensed it as a flicker, a hesitation, as if the beam stuttered in its eternal pulse. They tried to hide it. They tried to deny it. They had survived every cosmic storm, every warp tide, every horrific shift in Imperium currents that history had ever recorded. But never, not once, had they felt the Astronomicon flicker. It was constant, absolute, divine, until it wasn't. Navigator houses descended into panic. The eldest among them, those with third eyes so attuned to the warp they could see eternity crack, began falling unconscious, blood seeping from their sockets as if the universe itself had gouged them. Some awoke screaming, others never awoke at all. And the ones who did speak offered only fragments of horror, visions of a light shrinking, retracting, collapsing inward like a dying star. The Imperium's largest fleets were the first to feel the consequences. Ships traveling through the warp found their courses drifting unpredictably. Some shifted only a few degrees, enough to delay arrival. Others veered off so violently that entire armadas emerged thousands of light years from their intended destinations. A few did not emerge at all. Their last astropathic messages were garbled, frantic, filled with terror before cutting off mid-scream. The more time passed, the more navigators understood the truth they could no longer hide. The Astronomicon was fading, and with every hour that passed, it grew dimmer. The high admirals aboard the Imperium's greatest battle fleets panicked. They demanded answers from Terra. No answers came. They attempted to triangulate the diminishing signal, hoping to deduce whether this weakening was temporary or catastrophic. The calculations confirmed the nightmare. The Astronomicon was not fluctuating. It was dying. And then, one night cycle aboard a dozen scattered vessels, the light simply vanished. Not entirely, not yet, but enough that every navigator in that region of space collapsed simultaneously, clutching their heads as the warp roared back in triumph. The psychic pathways they had always relied on dissolved. Warp beasts stirred. Tendrils of unreality lashed against Geller fields. Even the most advanced vessels found themselves blind, adrift, and terrified. Across the galaxy, alarms screamed as captains realized their most essential truth. Humanity was now losing its ability to travel. Planets that depended on shipments of food faced the threat of starvation. War fronts that required reinforcements were suddenly isolated. Entire sectors risked collapsing into anarchy as communication lines failed one by one. And even on worlds that had never seen a void ship, people felt an unease, a sense that something immense and ancient had shifted. But what struck the Imperium hardest was not the loss of travel. It was the realization that the Emperor's guiding presence, the shield that held back the nightmares of the warp, was evaporating. Psychers across the galaxy heard them first, whispers. Not from the Astronomicon, but from something else. Something older, something hungry, as if the warp, deprived of the Emperor's dominance, were inhaling deeply, tasting freedom for the first time in 10,000 years. Some psychers burst into flames. Others became conduits for entities that had waited millennia for this moment. In some cities, mobs formed around psycher burnings. In others, entire populations surrendered to panic, screaming that the end had come. Governors begged Terra for guidance. Terra responded with silence. And in that silence, the warp howled. Faith had always been the Imperium's greatest weapon, and its most volatile weakness. For millennia, the ecclesiarchy kept the masses obedient through ritual, fear, and unwavering devotion to the Emperor's divinity. But faith is fragile when built on certainty, and certainty is the first casualty of truth. When the Emperor's light weakened, the priesthood felt the tremors long before anyone else. Sermons faltered, hymns wavered, holy relics that once pulsed faintly with psychic resonance lay dormant, cold to the touch. The priests of shrine worlds whispered prayers with trembling voices, hoping the Emperor would speak to them as he once had. He did not. Then came the moment that shattered everything. Across dozens of shrine worlds, statues of the Emperor, massive, ornate structures that had stood unshaken through wars, bombardments, and time itself, began to crack. Not from force, not from sabotage, but from within. Marble split, adamantium buckled, gold leaf peeled away like dead skin. Entire statues collapsed in slow, groaning descents, as if an invisible weight crushed the remnants of his image. Billions saw it happen. Billions felt the horror bloom inside them. The ecclesiarchy tried to explain it away. They called it a test, a cleansing, a spiritual renewal, but the people were no longer convinced. On the holy world of Ophelia 7, the cathedrals trembled as 1,000 candles extinguished themselves in perfect unison. Pilgrims fell to their knees, sobbing. Priests screamed prayers so desperately their voices broke. When no divine sign came, many fled in terror. But others stayed, and they demanded answers from their leaders. That was when the ecclesiarchy began to fracture. Moderate priests pleaded for calm, insisting that the Emperor's silence did not mean his end. Radical priests declared that the Golden Throne had been sabotaged by heretics. Still others, those who had seen too much, fell into despair, whispering forbidden truths under their breath. The High Ecclesiarch convened an emergency synod, one that quickly degenerated into chaos. Cardinals brandished accusations like weapons. Some called for galactic purges greater than any before, believing fear could restore faith. Others argued for unity, terrified that fanaticism would ignite civil war. But the most dangerous voice came from a cardinal who had long been dismissed as eccentric. He rose, trembling, and spoke the words that froze the chamber. His presence is gone. I cannot hear him anymore. The Emperor is dead. The synod erupted. Some cardinals demanded his execution on the spot. Others defended him. Inquisitors arrived, declaring the meeting heretical. Power-armored sisters of battle stood ready to kill or die at a gesture. For a moment, it seemed the ecclesiarchy itself would drown in its own fanaticism. And then, as if scripted by a cruel playwright, the worst possible thing happened. A psychic shockwave rippled through the heart of the ecclesiarchy. It slammed into the synod chamber with the force of 1,000 storms. Priests fell to their knees, clutching their heads, screaming as a flood of psychic static filled their minds. For centuries, their faith had given them a faint, comforting connection to the Emperor. A warmth, a whisper, a sense of being watched over. Now that connection was torn away so violently it felt like their souls were being flayed. Some died instantly, some went mad, others cried out in anguished denial. But all understood what the shockwave meant. Something had vanished, something immense, something divine. Word spread faster than the Inquisition could contain it. Entire hive cities erupted into riots as citizens realized the priests were powerless. Some worshipped harder than ever, desperate for reassurance. Others abandoned faith entirely. Still others turned to darker gods, whispering new prayers into the void that now stared back. And amid all this chaos, a terrifying truth began pulsing through the ecclesiarchy. If the Emperor is truly gone, then the Imperium has lost its soul. With the Astronomicon fading and the ecclesiarchy collapsing under its own doubt, the Imperium began to fracture in ways it had never experienced before. For 10,000 years, humanity had survived countless wars, heresies, and catastrophes because fear and faith were tightly controlled. The Emperor's presence was the linchpin. Remove it, and even the most disciplined systems began to wobble, teetering on the edge of chaos. Frontier worlds were the first to fall. Cut off from Terra by the dying Astronomicon, planetary governors faced impossible choices. Supply lines froze, communications failed, and military units became isolated. Some governors seized power ruthlessly, turning their worlds into police states to maintain control. Others abdicated entirely, leaving cities to spiral into mob rule. Local warlords emerged, each claiming divine or martial authority, and each answering only to themselves. In some regions, noble houses and planetary aristocracy began executing rivals on suspicion of treachery. In others, entire populations armed themselves with scavenged weapons, fearful that the Empire no longer protected them. The military, too, began to splinter. The Astra Militarum, once a monolithic force of discipline and obedience, became a mosaic of mutinies and rogue regiments. Soldiers questioned orders that no longer made sense. Captains and commanders struggled to maintain cohesion, but without the Emperor's psychic shadow to bind loyalty and will, fear overtook obedience. Battles erupted between loyalists and deserters on multiple worlds simultaneously, each engagement more savage and desperate than the last. Where once a single regiment could enforce order, now hundreds fought to survive. Amidst the turmoil, the Imperium's enemies smelled blood. Xenos opportunists, long held at bay by the collective might of humanity, launched raids with increasing audacity. Orcs, sensing weakness, erupted across border systems. Tyrannid tendrils probed worlds, finding them undefended. Even chaos cults, previously hunted to near extinction, swelled with new converts, their whispers promising power and vengeance to those who had lost hope in the Emperor's protection. And yet, the worst threat came from within. Humanity had always been capable of cruelty to itself, but now it was unshackled. Religious fanatics attacked skeptics. Rogue psychers unleashed uncontrolled warp storms. Local governors executed rival lords and inquisitors alike. Entire cities burned in the name of survival, fear, or vengeance. The Imperium's moral and social structure, so painstakingly built over millennia, was cracking, shard by shard. In this chaos, a new term began to circulate in hushed whispers, even among the elite: the Long Night. It described more than war or famine, it described the collapse of the very order humanity had clung to for 10,000 years. Some believed the Emperor's death had invited the galaxy itself to feast on humanity. Others believed it was merely the natural consequence of centuries of tyranny, dogma, and unchallenged rule. And while the galaxy descended into fear and conflict, one question remained in every mind, burning hotter than any fire or war machine. Without the Emperor, who, or what, truly rules the galaxy now? The absence of the Emperor's psychic dominance did more than fracture human institutions, it awakened forces that had long lurked beneath the surface of reality itself. The warp, once restrained by his will, surged outward like a tidal wave unbound. Its currents shifted violently, collapsing previously stable pathways and birthing new, unpredictable storms. Rogue psychers, untrained and desperate, became conduits for horrors that had waited millennia for freedom. Entire planets experienced visions so vivid, so absolute, that reality itself seemed to fracture under the weight of perception. Chaos cults, previously marginalized and hunted relentlessly, suddenly found themselves emboldened. Across the galaxy, small cells grew overnight into entire planetary movements. Worshippers invoked gods that had remained silent for ages, and those gods answered, not with mercy, but with hunger. Demons poured into the material realm, drawn like moths to a light that no longer existed. Where the Emperor's presence had once acted as a shield, there was now a void, a psychic vacuum that entities older than humanity could exploit with impunity. Even within the Imperium's own ranks, corruption spread. Commanders who had once obeyed without question began to make decisions based on fear, superstition, and rumor. Inquisitors, powerless to oversee all sectors, turned on each other, purging those they suspected of weakness or treachery. The Adeptus Mechanicus argued amongst themselves over whether the Emperor's death validated heretical beliefs, sparking skirmishes in the streets of Holy Mars. The galaxy teetered on the brink, balanced between human ambition and the inexorable hunger of the warp. Entire worlds burned in the name of survival. Hive cities descended into chaos as mobs, panicked and leaderless, hunted for scapegoats. Refugees flooded into neighboring systems, carrying disease, famine, and unrest. Starports overflowed with stranded fleets, their crews growing desperate and violent. And all the while, the Astronomicon continued to fade, leaving navigators blind, fleets adrift, and civilizations isolated. Yet amid the terror, the whispers began, voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, promising power, knowledge, and salvation. They were seductive and terrifying, infiltrating the minds of the weak and strong alike. Some psychers embraced them willingly, drawn by visions of godhood. Others resisted, only to be consumed by madness. And in that madness, entire armies turned on themselves or their allies, fracturing further the already crumbling order. The galaxy was no longer a place of structure or law. It was a void, hungry, chaotic, and alive. And the one question that haunted every corner of the Imperium, from the highest chambers of Terra to the furthest mining colonies in the void, remained the same. If the Emperor is dead, then what truly governs the fate of humanity now? The answer, though unspoken, was terrifyingly clear. Humanity was no longer protected, no longer guided, and no longer unified. And in the shadows of this newfound freedom, the galaxy's oldest predators stirred, their patience ending, their hunger renewed. The long night had begun, and nothing, not armies, not faith, not hope, could halt its advance. By now, the Imperium was a galaxy on fire, though not all of it burned with flame. Some worlds fell into war. Some fell into silence. Others simply vanished from communication, leaving nothing but ghost reports and drifting fleets. The death of the Emperor had not only shattered belief, it had broken the threads that held planets, sectors, and star systems together. The Imperium, once a monolith of terror and order, now existed as scattered shards, each isolated and vulnerable. On industrial hive worlds, workers abandoned their labor as fear consumed them. Factories ground to a halt, and food production dropped dramatically. Starvation became a reality almost overnight. In some cities, the desperate turned on each other, igniting riots that devoured entire districts in hours. The planetary governors, those who had once relied on strict discipline and fear, found their authority hollow. Their enforcers, once loyal, once unquestioning, now chose sides, joined mobs, or fled in terror. The semblance of order collapsed like sandcastles against a tide of despair. Frontier planets were even worse. Without the Astronomicon to guide them safely through the warp, fleets became lost, and entire systems were left unprotected. Xenos opportunists, orcs, tyrannids, even the cunning Eldar, took advantage of this unprecedented vulnerability. Worlds that had never seen war erupted in sudden, brutal conflict. Some civilizations perished without ever understanding the cause. Others survived by forsaking morality entirely, embracing violence, slavery, and tyranny as the only means of survival. Even revered forge worlds, bastions of industry and discipline, faltered. The tech priests argued endlessly, dividing over whether the Emperor's death implied the Omniscia had abandoned them or whether their faith had been misguided. Production faltered, war machines stood idle, and the titanic engines that had once been symbols of relentless order now rusted in silence. Mars itself began to tremble, not from foreign attack, but from internal strife. The Adeptus Mechanicus fractured into competing sects, each claiming their interpretation of sacred doctrine. Violence erupted in the streets of the holy city, and even the revered titans, bound by oaths, were sometimes turned against one another in moments of paranoia and suspicion. Perhaps the most tragic collapses occurred on shrine worlds, where faith and devotion had once been unshakable. Cathedrals became tombs, statues became rubble, and prayers echoed unanswered into emptiness. Entire populations abandoned devotion, replaced by fear, nihilism, or blind worship of whatever promise of power or protection could be grasped. The ecclesiarchy, already broken, could do nothing but shout into the void as entire planets ignored them entirely, or burned in rebellion. Through it all, one truth crystallized with horrifying clarity: without the Emperor, the Imperium was defenseless. Its walls, armies, and fleets were meaningless without the psychic guidance and unifying will that had once held it together. The galaxy was no longer under human dominion. It was free, but in that freedom lay annihilation. And as humanity's bastions fell, isolated and terrified, another truth became unavoidable. The predators of the universe were patient. But they were awake now. Chaos, Xenos, and the warp itself were no longer restrained. The galaxy had entered a new era, one in which survival was no longer assured, and the shadow of humanity's greatest lie, the death of the Emperor, stretched across every star, every world, every mind. Even among the Imperium's most disciplined and fanatical servants, cracks were forming. The Adeptus Astartes, long considered the unyielding warriors of humanity, were not immune to fear or doubt. Chapters stationed on distant worlds found themselves questioning orders, questioning loyalty, and, in some cases, questioning purpose itself. For 10,000 years, their service had been absolute, their faith in the Emperor unquestioned. Now, with the Golden Throne silent and the Astronomicon dimmed, even the greatest warriors began to falter. In isolated sectors, some Space Marine chapters began returning from crusades not with victory, but with confusion and suspicion. Veteran sergeants reported morale breaking among recruits and seasoned warriors alike. Whispers spread within the chapters: what is the point of our devotion if the Emperor is dead? What is the meaning of the oaths we swore when their target, the unifying presence of the Emperor, is gone? Arguments erupted within squads and squads within companies. Some chapters, cut off from Terra, decided to interpret the Emperor's death as liberation, freedom to act without the rigid constraints of doctrine. Others saw it as a call to vengeance, striking with fury against anyone who doubted the sanctity of their mission. Entire battle fleets turned on each other in confusion, misidentifying allies as enemies, consumed by panic and the psychic turbulence that now filled the galaxy. The Inquisition, which had always been the shadow that policed heresy and enforced order, faced its greatest test. Without the Emperor's psychic authority, their reach weakened. Many Inquisitors found themselves in impossible situations, forced to choose between loyalty to Terra, survival, and the chaotic impulses stirring among their own forces. Old rivalries erupted, secret vendettas were settled under the guise of necessity, and some Inquisitors openly questioned whether the Imperium itself was worth preserving. Even among planetary governors and military commanders, loyalty became a fluid concept. Alliances shattered, betrayals multiplied, and entire sectors succumbed to self-interest. Leaders who once acted with precision and discipline were now driven by fear. The concept of the greater good lost all meaning when the guiding hand of the Emperor had vanished. Local governors armed militias to defend against both external threats and internal insurrection. Old rivalries reignited as neighbors attacked neighbors, convinced that survival required ruthless preemption. And amid this chaos, subtle but profound shifts occurred within the minds of the ordinary people. For centuries, the population had been bound by faith and fear, living under the illusion that the Emperor watched over them. Now, with that illusion destroyed, citizens began questioning everything they had been taught. Some embraced nihilism, rejecting all authority. Others succumbed to panic-driven violence. Entire hive cities were engulfed in riots, while smaller settlements fractured into warring factions. Where once obedience and ritual had maintained stability, now only survival instincts remained, crude, violent, and uncompromising. The Imperium, once unyielding and monolithic, was no longer a single entity. It was a fractured mirror, each shard reflecting fear, doubt, and ambition. And as these fractures widened, the galaxy became a stage for the unrestrained forces of war, chaos, and predation. The ultimate truth had emerged: loyalty was gone. And without loyalty, humanity's empire was nothing but a hollow shell. The galaxy fell into silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of a world, no, a universe, holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable to arrive. The Emperor was gone, the golden throne cold, the Astronomicon dimmed into non-existence. Faith, loyalty, and order had shattered, leaving humanity exposed, fragmented, and terrified. Across billions of worlds, cries of confusion and despair echoed, yet there was no comfort, no guidance, no salvation. Only the empty, yawning void that had replaced the God who had once held the galaxy together. In the darkest corners of the Imperium, creatures long restrained by the Emperor's presence stirred. Chaos gods, hungry and cunning, whispered promises of power to mortals desperate enough to listen. Demons clawed their way into the material realm, unchallenged. Xenos fleets struck where resistance was weakest, feasting on worlds whose armies were consumed by infighting or despair. And the warp itself, now unbound, reshaped reality in ways no human mind could comprehend. Stars went dark, planets fell silent, civilizations vanished almost overnight. The galaxy had entered a new epoch, one not of dominion, but of survival against forces that cared nothing for humanity. Yet amid the ruin, a terrible clarity emerged. Humanity had always believed it was protected, guided, and eternal. Now it was painfully, brutally clear: nothing was eternal. Nothing was safe. The Emperor's death had stripped away the comforting illusion, leaving only the stark truth of existence. Survival was no longer guaranteed. Faith was no longer strength. Order was no longer possible. And yet, life persisted, stubborn and defiant, in the darkened ruins of what had once been a mighty empire. The Imperium, fractured, leaderless, and terrified, faced a future of endless war, endless suffering, and endless uncertainty. Some would cling to belief, praying for a miracle that would never come. Others would seize power, spreading tyranny in the vacuum left behind. Others still would surrender entirely, consumed by despair or the seductive embrace of chaos. The galaxy had no single ruler, no guiding light, no unifying force. Only the shadow of the Emperor's absence, stretching across every world, every mind, every soul. And so, the long night began. A night that would last not for a year, or a century, or a millennium, but for the entire future of humanity. Fear, chaos, and uncertainty would reign where once the Emperor's presence had kept the darkness at bay. The galaxy would scream, the warp would feast, and humanity, for the first time in 10,000 years, would truly understand what it meant to live without its god. In the end, one question remained, echoing across the void. If the Emperor is dead, then what hope remains for those who survive? No answer came, only the dark, endless silence. The story ends here, leaving the galaxy shattered, the Imperium in ruin, and the audience with a lingering sense of dread and suspense, the perfect conclusion for a faceless, gripping Warhammer 40k narrative. If you want, I can now compile all sections into one continuous, polished script ready for a full 30,000-word faceless YouTube narration. It will flow seamlessly from start to finish, keeping the suspense tight throughout. Do you want me to do that next?